My name is Silas Thornwell, and I was born in the spring of 1830 on a patch of worn-out land in Cooper County, Missouri. My father, Amos Thornwell, he'd come back from the War of 1812 with a limp in his left leg and a bitterness that never quite healed right, you understand. He took up farming because that's what a man did, but the soil there, it was stubborn. Fought him every season. We had corn that grew thin as pencils, wheat that came up patchy, and a vegetable garden my mother Prudence tended like it was her own child, because, well, it was the only thing keeping us from going truly hungry most years. I remember my father's hands, thick, scarred hands that never seemed to get clean, no matter how much he scrubbed them. He'd sit at our table in the evenings, and he wouldn't say much, just stare at those hands like they'd betrayed him somehow. My mother, she passed when I was 16, took sick with a fever in the winter of 1846. After that, it was just me and my younger sister Mehitabel. We called her Hetty, and our father, who seemed to get quieter and harder with every crop that failed. Then, in the late fall of 1848, a traveling merchant named Obadiah Creech came through our county. He had a newspaper, crumpled and stained from traveling, maybe 2 months old, and it had these stories about gold, about a discovery out in California. Real gold, just sitting in the rivers, they said, men scooping it up by the handful. Now, I know that sounds foolish when I say it out loud here in 1918, 70 years later, but you have to understand what that meant to a boy of 18 years old who'd watched his father break himself against dirt that wouldn't give nothing back. I read that newspaper probably 50 times. Wore the creases white. My father, he saw me reading it one evening by the lamp, and he said, "Don't go filling your head with fool's dreams, Silas. Gold rushes are for men with nothing to lose. We got responsibilities here." But the thing was, I looked around that cabin, at the gaps in the walls we stuffed with rags every winter, at Hetty's dress that had been patched so many times, you couldn't tell what the original fabric was anymore. And I thought, what exactly am I holding on to here? What future am I protecting? I made my decision on a February morning in 1849. Cold enough you could see your breath inside the cabin. I told my father I was going west, going to California. He didn't yell. I think I would have preferred yelling. He just looked at me with those tired eyes and said, "He'll be back inside a year, broke and ashamed, just like I came back from the war." Then he turned away and went out to the barn, and that was that. Hetty cried when I left. She was only 13, and I promised her I'd send money home soon as I struck it. I still see her face sometimes, standing in the doorway of that cabin, her breath making little clouds in the cold air, watching her big brother walk away down that frozen road. I had $43 saved, a bedroll, and a rifle that had been my grandfather's. That was the entirety of my fortune when I started for California. I met up with a westbound company in Independence, Missouri, in early April of 1849. There must have been 200 wagons gathering there, maybe more, all of us waiting for the grass to green up enough to feed the livestock on the trail. The man organizing our particular company was a fellow named Jarvis Mumford, called himself Captain Mumford, though I don't think he'd ever been in any army. He'd worked as a trapper up in the Rockies for some years, knew the trails, and that was qualification enough for most of us. He was a hard man. Captain Mumford had a way of looking at you that made you feel about 6 years old, but I suppose we needed that kind of leadership for what was coming. I fell in with a young man from Ohio named Roscoe Bollinger. He was 22, 2 years older than me, and he had this way of talking about California like it was the Garden of Eden itself. We'd sit by the fire those first weeks on the trail, and Roscoe would go on about the ranch he was going to buy, the house he'd build, maybe find a wife out there in that golden country. I mostly listened. I wasn't much for talking about dreams out loud, Felt like it might jinx the whole thing, you understand. But I liked listening to Roscoe. His voice had hope in it, and that was something I hadn't heard much of back home. There was a family traveling with us, the Dunphys. Thaddeus and Dorcas Dunphy, with their twin boys, Luther and Virgil, who were about 8 years old. Those boys treated the whole journey like it was some grand adventure, running alongside the wagons, chasing jackrabbits, collecting strange rocks. Their mother would call after them, "You stay where I can see you," but she'd be smiling when she said it. I envied those boys sometimes, the way they could find joy in the dust and the heat and the endless walking. There was another man in our company, a Southerner named Webb Kirby, who said he'd been a tracker of runaway slaves before coming west. Nobody much liked Webb Kirby. He had a mean streak in him that showed itself in how he treated his animals, how he'd talk about the Indians we saw at a distance, how he'd pick fights over nothing when the whiskey came out at night. The trail itself, well, it's hard to explain to someone who hasn't seen it. It wasn't like a road, not really. It was more like a scar across the land, all these wagon ruts worn down by the thousands who'd gone before us. The dust got into everything, your clothes, your food, your lungs. You'd cough up brown at night and wake up with it crusted in your eyes. We followed the Platte River for what felt like forever, that wide, shallow river that someone said was a mile wide and an inch deep, and you could see the whole sky out there, bigger than any sky I'd seen in Missouri. Some days it was beautiful in a way that made your chest ache. Other days it was just hot and endless, and you'd start to wonder why you'd ever left home. We lost Roscoe Bollinger at a crossing of the North Platte in late June. The water was running high from Mountain Snolt, and one of the wagons, the Dunphy's wagon, it started to tip in the current. The boys were inside. Roscoe didn't hesitate, just plunged right in trying to steady it, and the current took him. Just like that. We found his body 3 miles downstream the next day, caught up in some tree roots. He still had that hopeful look on his face, or maybe I just imagined that because I needed him to look peaceful. We buried him on a rise overlooking the river, marked it with stones, and Captain Mumford said a few words from the Bible. Then we moved on, because that's what you did out there. You buried your dead, and you moved on, because if you stopped moving, you'd die too. I took Roscoe's hat. He had a good hat, better than mine. I wore it the rest of the way to California, and I'm wearing it in my mind right now as I tell you this. We came down out of the Sierra Nevada in late October of 1849, and I got my first look at the mining camps in the foothills. The place they called Hangtown, which later became Placerville, it wasn't like any town I'd ever seen. It was more like someone had taken 1,000 men and just dropped them into a ravine with picks and shovels and told them to tear the earth apart. Tents everywhere, canvas shelters leaning against trees, mud streets that weren't really streets at all, just paths worn down between the diggings. And the noise, Lord, the noise of it. Picks hitting rock, sluice boxes rattling, men shouting in a dozen different languages, some English, some Spanish, some Chinese, some tongues I couldn't even begin to identify. The smell was something too. All those men living close together, not much in the way of proper sanitation, wood smoke and unwashed bodies, and the metallic scent of disturbed earth, all mixing together into something that made your eyes water until you got used to it. I learned pretty quick that all the easy gold was gone. The stories we'd heard back in Missouri about nuggets the size of your fist just lying in the stream beds. Well, maybe that had been true in '48 when the rush first started, but by the time I got there, every decent claim was already staked. Men were working claims that barely paid enough to keep them fed, but they kept working them because what else were they going to do? Go home and admit failure? I spent the first 2 months working for other men, doing day labor on their claims for a percentage of whatever came out. Some days that meant $3. Some days it meant 75 cents. Some days it meant nothing at all. I slept in a tent I shared with 5 other men, and it cost me $2 a week for that privilege. A single egg cost $1. A loaf of bread cost $2. A shot of whiskey, if you wanted to forget how cold you were, or how much your back hurt, that was 50 cents for rot gut that tasted like it might make you go blind. There was a man named Gideon Fitch, who owned one of the better claims up near the North Fork, and he took a liking to me, I suppose because I worked hard and didn't complain and didn't try to steal from him, which apparently made me unusual. Gideon taught me the real work of mining, showed me how to read the geology, how water moved gold through the gravel, how to spot color in a pan. He was maybe 45 years old, had been in California since 48, and he had this patient way of explaining things that reminded me a little of my mother. God rest her. I worked Gideon's claim through that winter, and in March of 1850, I partnered up with another man, Clement Hogue. Everyone called him Clem. Clem was from Vermont, had been a carpenter back there, and he had these careful hands that were good at building sluice boxes and keeping equipment working when it wanted to fall apart. I found my first real gold on a cold morning in April. We were working a section of Gideon's claim that he'd given us permission to try, and I saw it there in my pan, this little nugget about the size of a lima bean, just sitting there in the black sand, catching the light. My hand started shaking, so bad I almost dropped the whole pan. Clem came over and looked, and we both just stood there staring at it like it might disappear if we blinked. That nugget was worth maybe $12, which doesn't sound like much, but it was the first gold that was actually mine, you understand? Not wages, not a percentage, but mine. I kept it in my pocket for 3 days, just touching it through the fabric to make sure it was still there before I finally took it to the assayer and got my money. But I learned something else that week, too. There was a man, a claim jumper named Lyle Draper, who'd been working his way through the camps, intimidating smaller miners, taking what wasn't his. He tried it on a Chinese man named Hong Wei, who ran a laundry operation down by the creek. Hong Wei didn't have much, but what he had, he'd earned honest. Draper took it anyway, roughed Hong Wei up pretty good in the process. Well, the miners in that camp, they had their own sense of justice. They held a trial that lasted maybe 20 minutes, found Draper guilty, and hung him from an oak tree before sunset. I watched it happen. I was 19 years old, and I watched a man kick and struggle at the end of a rope until he went still, and nobody said a word against it. That's when I understood that California wasn't the golden paradise Roscoe had dreamed about. It was hard country, and it made hard men out of whoever survived it. In the spring of 1851, Clem and I found something. We'd been prospecting up a creek that fed into the American River, a little tributary that most men had passed over because it looked played out, and we found a spot where the bedrock had a natural riffle that had been catching gold for probably centuries. We worked that claim for 3 months, from April through June, and we pulled out close to $4,000 worth of gold between the two of us. $4,000. I'd write letters to Hetty at night, telling her I'd be home by Christmas, telling her I was going to buy back our farm and fix it up proper, maybe buy the land next to it too. Clem, he was planning to go back to Vermont and open a furniture shop, said he was done with California, done with sleeping on the ground and eating beans and bacon every meal. We had it all figured out, the two of us. We were going to work through July, maybe August, get a little more out of that claim, and then we'd head back east before the winter snows closed the passes. We thought we'd beaten it, thought we'd won. Then the cholera came. It swept through the camps in late June like wildfire through dry grass, and it didn't care how much gold you had or how careful you were, or whether you'd worked hard and played fair. Men would be fine in the morning and dead by nightfall. The sickness would hit you in the gut like someone punched you, and then you'd start losing water from both ends, and there wasn't nothing anyone could do but watch you waste away. Clem got it on a Tuesday. I remember that clear as anything. We'd been working the claim, and he said his stomach felt wrong, said maybe it was something he ate. By that evening, he couldn't stand up. By Wednesday morning, he was delirious, talking to people who weren't there, calling out for his mother. I stayed with him in that tent, trying to get water down him, but it just came right back up. He died on Thursday, just before dawn. 48 hours from healthy to dead, and he was only 24 years old. I got sick myself that same day, right after we buried Clem. I remember digging his grave, and my hands were shaking, and I thought it was just because I was crying. But then the cramps hit me, and I knew I had it too. They took me to what they called the sick tent, which was really just a larger canvas shelter where they put all of us who were dying, I suppose, so we wouldn't spread it around as much. The vet didn't work very well. There was a doctor there, fellow named Phineas Caldwell, and he was charging $5 just to look at you. $10 for medicine that was probably just sugar water. I was out of my head for most of a week. Don't remember much of it except fever dreams and the smell of death all around me. Somehow I lived. A lot of men didn't. There was a Cornish miner named Ezra Talmadge at the tent next to me, and he survived too, but the cholera or the infection or something took his left leg. They cut it off with a saw, and I was conscious enough to hear him screaming through it. When I finally got strong enough to walk again, maybe 3 weeks after Clem died, I went to check on our gold. We'd hidden it in a strongbox buried under our tent. The tent was gone. The strongbox was gone. Everything was gone. I found Dr. Caldwell and asked him about it, and he showed me a bill, all written out official looking, saying I owed him $340 for medical care, and tent space and medicine and burial fees for Clem. Said he'd taken my gold to settle the debt. Said I should be grateful. I had enough to cover it. I had maybe 6 ounces left, the gold I'd kept in my boots that they hadn't found. That was it. 3 months of backbreaking work, my partner dead, and I had less than I'd started with when I came down out of the mountains a year and a half before. Hong Wei was the one who told me the truth. Told me quiet-like that Caldwell had been doing it to all the men who got sick and survived, inventing debts and taking their gold. But what could I do about it? Same justice that hung Lyle Draper. Well, it didn't apply to white men with education and fancy clothes, you understand. That's another thing I learned in California. Justice wasn't blind. It could see just fine, and it knew who had money and who didn't. I never went back to Missouri. I meant to, wrote letters saying I would, but I never did. I worked the claims for another 6 years, moving from camp to camp, saving what I could, learning to be careful with money in a way I'd never had to be before. By 1857, I had enough put aside to leave the diggings for good. I opened a general store in Sacramento, sold supplies to miners who were still chasing that dream I'd given up on. It was steady work, honest work, and it didn't break my back the way mining had. I met my wife Martha in 1862 at a funeral, of all places. She was a widow with 2 daughters from her first marriage, Clementine and Sarah, and we had a quiet wedding that spring. We had 1 son together, born in 1864, and I named him Amos, after my father. I thought maybe that would make peace with something. I don't know. My father died in 1853. Never knew if I'd made anything of myself out here. Hetty wrote me about it, said he'd gone quietly in his sleep, and I felt sad about it, but also relieved in a way I'm not proud of. Amos, my son, he died last month. The Spanish influenza got him, same sickness that's been taking so many. He was 54 years old, had children of his own, and I had to bury my boy, which is something no parent should have to do. That's why I'm telling you all this now, I suppose. Someone asked me to talk about the gold rush for some historical society project, and I said yes because I've been thinking about death a lot lately, about what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. Roscoe Bollinger, Clement Hogue, all those men who died in the camps or on the trail. Nobody remembers them now except me, and soon I'll be gone too, and then it'll be like they never existed at all. People ask me sometimes if it was worth it, going to California, chasing gold. I never got rich. I never struck it big like some men did, but I saw the country get made, you understand? I was there when California went from being a wild territory to being a state. I saw Sacramento grow from a collection of tents to a real city. I married a good woman, raised children, built something that lasted. The gold was never really the point, I think. Or maybe it was the point at first, but somewhere along the way it became about something else, about seeing if you could survive it, about finding out what kind of man you'd be when everything was hard, and there was nobody watching to make sure you did the right thing. I still have one piece of gold, a little nugget about the size of a pea that I found in 1852. Never sold it. Nobody ever stole it. Just kept it all these years. Sometimes I take it out and hold it in my hand, feel the weight of it, and I think about Roscoe talking about his ranch, about Clem planning his furniture shop, about all the men who didn't make it home. And I think about that boy who left Missouri in 1849 with $43 and a head full of dreams. And I wonder if he'd be disappointed in how things turned out, or if maybe he'd understand that just surviving was victory enough.